Dilgard by Reddit user ColeKenneth56. I don't recall ever seeing Mr. Dilgard outside of his house, not counting the day that the coroner took him away. As far as I knew, he was a pretty nice old guy. Well, nice in the way that a 10-year-old boy can view any elderly person as nice. They all seem sort of strange at that age, don't they? I was raised by my grandmother in a small neighbourhood in the outskirts of Cleveland. Not quite the city, but not quite the suburbs either. Right on the fringe. Its residents were mostly Slavic immigrants. It consisted of one long street, with a butcher and baker shop at one end, an urban park on the other, and tightly packed row houses in between. The neighbourhood had been built around the 1950s, shortly after the Second World War. All the houses were pretty much the same, alternating ranch homes and duplexes, each one looking exactly like the others. All except one house. Mr. Dilgard's house. Mr. Dilgard's house sat at the far end of the street, 2 houses down from my grandmother's. It was the only unique house in the neighbourhood, perhaps because it was built early on, before developers came in. That house was the envy of all the neighbours, and the most intriguing to the kids. Unlike the other homes, which were constructed of wood, and at some point wrapped in aluminium siding, Mr. Dilgard's house was made of stacked stone. It was a 2-storey single-family home, huge in relation to the other houses. The stone had probably been light brown sandstone at one point, but eventually turned to a greenish colour because of all the moss and lichen growing on the crevices. It also had thick ropes of dark green ivy growing up most sides, reaching all the way to the roof in the back. The coolest part of it, at least to my friends and I, was the glass conservatory affixed to the 2nd storey at the rear of the home. It was difficult to see in because of the ivy growing around it, but we imagined how it might look inside. I thought that I was lucky, because my grandmother paid daily visits to Mr. Dilgard. He was a widower and living alone. My grandmother had always been the maternal sort, and would constantly take over casseroles and leftovers for him. She occasionally sent me over to deliver these, and each time I was hoping to get invited in, and maybe, just maybe, get to see inside of that room. Of course, as a young boy, I didn't think that it was proper for me to pry into an adult's life, and therefore never got up the courage to ask. Decades have passed since then, but what came to pass still makes the hairs on the back of my neck raise when I think about it. It started out being a curiosity, then it became creepy, and then went all the way down the rabbit hole to insanity. My friends and I would play in our postage stamp sized backyards just about all day, every day during the summer. Drinking from the hose, digging in the dirt, playing cowboys and Indians, which wasn't considered politically incorrect back in those days. All of the neighbours were friendly, and most could be found sitting on their front or back porches at some point during the day. They'd wave, smile, and occasionally offer us a drink or snack. It was pretty much a given that no one minded that we ran off from yard to yard during our adventures. It just went unsaid, but we never played in Mr. Dilgard's yard. The grass had gone to seed, his driveway was just a cracked mess of old asphalt with weeds growing through it, and despite being at the end of an otherwise sunny street, due to the thick stand of trees bordering its side and back, it always seemed dark. Besides, as I mentioned earlier, Mr. Dilgard never left his house, so we weren't sure how he'd feel about having us in his yard. For the most part we were well-behaved boys, and polite enough to avoid risking upsetting him. However, as we sat on my lawn, digging worms out of the dirt for a planned expedition to a little fishing pond in our park, I happened to glance towards Mr. Dilgard's house, specifically that little conservatory at the back of the 2nd floor. A brief glance indicated that someone was watching us, from behind the clouded glass. I did a double take just to be certain, and he must have noticed me staring and backed away. I know that I had no reason to think so, but I somehow got the impression that he didn't approve of our shenanigans. Having noticed our spectator once, my eyes would wander over to the conservatory on a regular basis, and, sure enough, every time I looked up, he was watching us. Every time. Eventually he became so bold that he didn't back away when we caught him staring. I mentioned it to my friends, and soon we were all checking him out, silently daring him to make the next move, perhaps open the window. I asked my grandmother why Mr. Dilgard was always watching us. Was he just bored? Did he have a sinister ulterior motive? She just dismissed me and said I was being ridiculous, as he was too old to even climb the stairs anymore. If I thought I saw anyone up in the conservatory, it was just my imagination. Still, I knew that I wasn't just conjuring it up in my head. My friends had seen him too. I was so insistent and made such a pest of myself that my grandmother eventually relented and told me that she'd take me along on one of her afternoon visits. She would finally show me the inside of the house, and she was certain that it would finally provide proof that it was impossible for Mr. Dilgard to have been spying on us from the conservatory. Grandmother had a box filled with half a dozen of her homemade cushions. Cushion is a German word for cake, but they were more like little loaves of bread with a crumbly topping and filled with jam. It's German tradition to invite friends to one's home for an afternoon snack with tea or coffee. Since Mr. Dilgard was homebound, we would take the gathering to him. I was nervous on the walk over, but my stomach was grumbling at the thought of those delicious cakes. I hoped that my grandmother was correct, and I would leave Mr. Dilgard's home later that afternoon convinced that our fanciful imaginations had gotten away with us, and us kids weren't seeing a person watching us, but perhaps an old blanket or sheet moving in the breeze. With each step my paranoia melted away, and by the time we knocked on the door, I was under the impression that my grandmother had been right all along. But then we went inside. Mr. Dilgard was seated in an old leather armchair in his parlour. We weaved our way through boxes, piles of newspaper and furniture. Too much furniture, and pieces too large for a house of this size. I didn't know the word as a kid, but I later came to find out that he was apparently what's called a hoarder. Grandmother said that he never threw anything away, except garbage of course, and she joked that the only reason that got taken to the curb is because she cleaned his kitchen when he was napping or not paying attention. I took a seat, perched on the edge of another armchair across from Mr. Dilgard, while my grandmother went to the kitchen to put the kettle on. I smiled and made some polite small talk, but it seemed as if my grandmother was taking forever. When I'd exhausted myself with all the generic remarks I could come up with, I sat in silence and took in the scene around me. The hardwood floors were covered in places with threadbare throw rugs and Cartian designs. Not dirty or dusty though. My grandmother made sure of that. The plaster walls were covered in most places by peeling wallpaper, floral and obviously Mrs. Dilgard's choice. Grandmother said that she'd passed away long ago. Mr. Dilgard had already been a widower when she first moved into the neighbourhood. The armchair that I occupied, as well as the oversized couch and love seat in the room, were similarly decorated in flowery print. I distinctly remember the smell. There was the smell of grandmother's cushion, which sat on the table in front of me, and the smell of strong coffee wafting in from the kitchen. But there was an underlying permanent smell. The house's smell. It smelt like dust even though there was none to be seen, and mould, dank, wet, leathery. Basically it smelled like an old person, but mixed in with a sickly sweet smell. Something I'd smelled once before, but still couldn't quite place it. It turned my stomach though, and I had lost my appetite. I drank the small cup of coffee that my grandmother had given me, but I declined the little cake she'd plated for me. She looked concerned, but placed it back into the box. She'd leave them for Mr. Dilgard, of course. When we'd finished up, she caught my eye and gave me a barely discernible nod towards the kitchen. "Why don't you get the cups and plates and help me clean up, honey?" I did as she said, and then followed her deeper into the house. When we got to the kitchen, she had me set the dishware in the sink and beckoned me to follow her. I did, and we reached what I imagined to be the rear of the home. It was disorientating because of our erratic path through what had to be decades of collected junk. We stepped onto a little landing. Grandmother arched her eyebrows and looked at me, a touch of humour twinkling in her eyes. "Still think that Mr. Dilgard's been going upstairs to watch you?" She didn't need to explain any further. There were steps leading both up and down from the landing, presumably to the second story and the basement, respectively. They were packed, top to bottom, with more of Mr. Dilgard's collections of odds and ends. I felt deflated. "You see, sweetie, Mr. Dilgard's not watching you from his conservatory," Grandmother said patiently. "Even I couldn't get up there, and my hips are in much better condition." She was right, of course. We finished cleaning up the dishes, made our farewells, and walked back home. I felt relieved and yet confused, as if there was a hollow place in my stomach. Unfulfilled. I knew that Grandmother was right. There was no way that Mr. Dilgard was getting up those steps, not unless he had a secret he was keeping from my grandmother. That thought still bugged me though. That very evening, excited to tell my friends, I explained everything I'd seen. I explained, without much conviction, that it was impossible for the old man to be spying on us. Just as the words crossed my lips, we collectively raised our heads to look at the second floor room to reassure ourselves that we now knew the truth, that our eyes had been playing tricks on us. But there he was. We knew without a shadow of a doubt it wasn't a blanket, not a rolled up rug, not even a dresser's mannequin, because of its eyes. You could see the reflection of the setting sun glinting in his eyes as he scanned back and forth. It continued for the next week or so, the watching. I don't know why it bothered us so much. It wasn't as if he was doing anything that could harm us. Still, we found ourselves trying to play in other people's yards more often, avoiding anywhere that his gaze could follow us. Finally, as young boys often do, we came up with a stupid plan. Someone would sneak into his house and find the room, put an end to this for once and for all. If there was something up there, something that we could be mistaken for a person, then we would put an end to it. We decided that it would be best for only one of us to go, for the sake of being stealthy. It wasn't as if he'd hurt us, right? He was just a frail old man. Unfortunately, I was the one picked to go, mostly because I'd been in his house before. I was patient and waited for one of the days that my grandmother had asked me to deliver a casserole. Generally I'd knock and he would arrive at the door to accept it. This time I decided that I would take it inside for him. I planned to go in quietly, and if he caught me I could say that I did knock and he probably didn't hear, so I decided just to bring it in. This was back at the time when no one locked their doors. Neighbourhoods were safe. Entering someone's house, as long as you were courteous, wasn't considered offensive. If someone didn't want to be bothered, they'd lock up, but most people never did. I could feel the sweat running down my back, between my shoulder blades as I walked over. Once on Mr. Dilgard's back porch, I knocked very lightly, just in case. Then it wouldn't be a lie if I had to say that the old man hadn't heard me. I balanced the corningware dish, the white ones with the blue flowers, on my hip and pulled open the screen door. I entered and let the door close behind me, slowing its travel with my rear end so as not to allow it to bang shut. I stopped, waited, and listened very carefully. I didn't hear anyone moving around, so I set the casserole dish in the kitchen table and planned out my next move. I calmed myself and decided to risk a peek around the corner and into the parlour. Maybe he'd fallen asleep and was napping in his chair. I held on to that hope, as it would provide me with a little extra confidence. I'd failed to come up with a strategy for making my way through all the junk blocking the stairs to the second floor. He wasn't in his parlour. I began surveying the remainder of the first floor. Each empty room added to my surety that Mr. Dilgard was indeed up in the conservatory at that very moment. Perhaps it would not even be necessary for me to check it out, although, to be honest, I really did want to see the interior of that room. The only room left for me to check was Mr. Dilgard's first floor bedroom. It was late in the afternoon, and I was doubtful that he'd still be in bed, but I needed to be sure. I only made it halfway down the hall when the stench hit me. It was a mixture of rotting meat, shit, cheese, mixed with a few drops of cheap perfume. I instinctively gagged, but pressed on, already having a sense of what I was going to find. Even with my nose pinched shut and lips pressed together, I vomited when I entered the bedroom and saw him. Poor Mister Dilgard must have died in his sleep. He lay in bed, mouth open, and dead eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. He must have released his bowels when he died, but aside from that, there was no signs of pain or struggling. I hoped that he'd gone peacefully. The next few days passed quickly, a blur of emotions, feelings, sickness. I could barely sleep because of the nightmares. My grandmother tried to console me. She said that I shouldn't have had to be the one to find him like that. A boy's first experience with death shouldn't have been that devastating. Children need to learn about these things slowly. It wasn't proper for them to encounter an unpresentable corpse. No, the first time. Every time, if one was lucky enough, should be looking at the person, loved one or not, made presentable by an undertaker. It was just easier that way. Easier to think that death was perhaps not something so revolting. It was as if when I removed my good suit that I'd worn to the funeral, I also removed the feelings associated with Mr. Dilgard's passing. I somehow quickly assumed the normal routine of a kid my age. I went back to school. I went back to playing with my friends. Yes, there were the wide-eyed questions that everyone had. What did he look like? Did he stink? Was there blood all over? Do you think that he was murdered? I'll bet he was murdered. All the silly questions and theories of young boys that you could think of. It only took a few days to exhaust their interest, and then we went back to playing as normal. Only now we could play without our mysterious watcher. We were sad in a way, now wishing that he was still alive, watching or not. But he was. My friend Keith was the first one to see it. We were playing kickball when he just stopped. He stopped running and his jaw fell open. The rest of us followed his gaze upwards towards Mr. Dilgard's conservatory. Unmistakably dead Mr. Dilgard's conservatory. Only there was someone there. Someone still watching. And now they weren't even trying to be subtle about it. We could see them moving back and forth, going from window to window, tilting their head to get a better look. Once they had our undivided attention, they slammed their hands against the glass, and we saw a pale face approach the window. It was over in a split second, but it was real. No mistaking it. We heard it. We stopped playing in my backyard altogether. We just couldn't bring ourselves to do it. It was too uncomfortable. Too scary. Whenever I left the house to go to school, take a trip to the store, even take out the trash, I kept my eyes fixed on the ground, not daring to look up even for 1 second. I tried distracting my grandmother too when we were outside. If she had looked up and seen something, well, her confirmation would probably drive me insane. Weeks passed before a disturbing revelation came to light. Much to the air of my grandmother, Mr. Dilgard's estranged daughter eventually showed up to clean the house and prepare it for sale. Hasn't visited him in years, but now there's an inheritance she comes sniffing around, grandmother would say, sometimes several times a day to various friends and neighbours. It turned out that Mr. Dilgard's daughter ended up with more troubles than a windfall. You see, when she and her husband cleared out the furniture, collected items and debris, they eventually made their way to the back staircase. Having moved aside enough refuse, they made a grisly discovery on the second floor conservatory. They found the body of Mrs. Dilgard, the person whom all the neighbours had assumed died long ago. While this was an unpleasant discovery, particularly repugnant to me since it brought back visions of the first time I found Mr. Dilgard, it was a bit of a relief. After all, seeing evidence that our watcher was still up there, even after Mr. Dilgard's death, was disconcerting. This explained it. Somehow, some way, she'd been living in that house, and it was likely that it was she who'd been watching us all along. My relief was short-lived, however, when word about her got around the neighbourhood. According to the coroner, Mrs. Dilgard's corpse was desiccated, essentially mummified, evidence that she'd passed quite a while back, probably even before my grandmother moved into the neighbourhood. The house never did sell. Realtors are required to provide disclosures to potential buyers regarding things that may have happened in the home or the neighbourhood. A death in the home was one of those things. Besides, even if the realtor had gotten around mentioning it somehow, you could never quite get the stink of death out of the place. You could take out the furniture, remove the carpets, even add fresh paint, but the spoiled meat smell seeps into the plaster and wood itself, and no amount of candle or air freshener would ever fix that. Years passed, and I eventually had the unfortunate task of selling off my own grandmother's estate after her passing. God rest her soul. On my final day there, after saying one last goodbye to the house that I had been raised in, I locked up the back door and walked down the driveway towards my car. As I did, I dared to take one last look at old Mister Dilgard's conservatory, and she was still watching. Hello listeners, I just wanted to say a massive thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please give it a like and don't forget to subscribe if you'd like to see more of my content. You can also check out more from this author, linked in the description down below. And until we meet again, sleep well.